Welcome back to this special edition of Verdict with Ted Cruz and my one-on-one conversation with Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. In Part 1, we explored the remarkable journey that shaped the man. Now we turn to the justice, his more than 3 decades on the Supreme Court, his approach to the Constitution, and why he believes its protections belong not to judges, not to law professors, but to every single American. Here's Part 2 of my conversation with Justice Clarence Thomas. By any measure, one of your greatest legacies on the court, and there are many, but has been on race. And you have been a clarion voice in your entire tenure on the court for the principle that the Constitution does not allow racial distinctions, does not allow racial discrimination. The Constitution is colorblind and protects everyone. You know, it's interesting as you tell the story or the analogy of the library and then the stacks and the books that you might not be allowed to read. One story you have told is as a young man, I think in law school, somebody gave you a copy of a book by Thomas Sowell, and you started to read it and threw it in the trash and said, if I remember right, that no black man can think this way.
Yeah. That was Black Education, Myths and Tragedies, I think, that one of his early books, and he laughs about it. Then, of course, he sent me a copy just to make sure I had it. But then after law school, I was working in Jeff City. It's one of those Hobson's choices. That's how I wound up there. The only job offer I had, but it's the best job I've ever had.
But all the fancy law firms wouldn't give you an offer.
No,
you came out of Yale Law School, did really well in law school.
Doesn't matter. And I always tell them now when I see them, they're the reason I'm on the court, because but for them, I'd be a tax lawyer someplace. And they're woke now, but they were fast asleep when I got out of school. So anyway, God works in mysterious ways. I wind up in Jeff City. And
so you're working for Jack Danforth, who was the Attorney General in Missouri.
Absolutely wonderful man.
And your classmates were asking, what are you doing going to work for a Republican?
Yeah.
Now, he was the only one who would give you a job.
He was the only one who gave me a job. I mean, I had trouble with that. I mean, I was dying. Remember, I just voted for McGovern.
Yeah.
You know, and I thought he was too conservative. So you can see ideologically where I was. But I go to work for him, best job I've ever had.
Well, and you said when you came in, you said, look, I don't want to work on matters of race. I don't want to be treated differently than anyone else. And you joked that he took you very seriously.
Yeah,
and
he ignored all of us. But
you loved that job.
I loved it. It was the best job I've ever had, $11,000 a year. And he promised, he said, I can give you more work for less money than anybody in the country. And that turned out to be a blessing. But at any rate, that office, the way that he ran that office was just wonderful, even-handed. One of the people I met who became a very dear friend was a quadriplegic from West Point, Nebraska. And went to University of Missouri Law School, graduated Order of the Coif, but had suffered from polio and was a quadriplegic. Just a very, very, very dear friend. He calls me up one day and he said, Clarence, there's another black guy out here like you. And his name is Thomas Sowell. And it was Thomas Sowell. And he had run, and it was a book review in the Wall Street Journal. And it was on race and economics. And I obtained copies of that. And it became just sort of the beginning of the long intellectual walk back of thinking about these things. And I met him at Washington University on a panel with Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she was a professor in the late 70s. And then when I came here in 79, I think I met him again either in 79 or 80 when he was making the rounds with Hill staffers. And we've been friends since the early 1980s.
By the way, for what it's worth, I'm urging the White House to award him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I hope they do so. I've publicly called for that, and I'm trying to make that happen because I think that would be very appropriate.
Yeah, well, I think it would be deserved.
Yes.
He is a great, great man and one of the great thinkers.
I've never met him, but I've admired him. He's brilliant and courageous.
Well, he's courageous, and I met him. I met Walter Williams back then when I got here.
I met Walter Williams when I was in high school.
Is that right?
Yeah, he was inspiring even when I was a kid.
Brash, but and there was another gentleman that you don't know that's also passed away, like Walter, Dave, who's was also very quiet, but a libertarian and was very, very helpful. But anyway, the whole point is that in Jefferson City, again, I go back to what I said at the very beginning, that things that initially seem like a negative, you can't get a job, so you wind up in Jeff City, turn out to be a blessing. So what I say in retrospect is that God closed all the doors that I should not have gone through.
Yep.
And left one door open, my Hobson's choice, and turned out to be the best job I've ever had.
All right, let me take a quick second. I want to talk to you about how you can get involved right now to help the people in Israel and the rising anti-Semitism that's happening not only in the U.S., but around the world every day. And the Jewish people continue to pay the price, from growing threats against Jewish communities to acts of violence, harassment, and intimidation. Many Jewish families are living with fear simply because they are Jewish. Synagogues, schools, and community centers continue strengthening security as hatred spreads far beyond the headlines. And that's why the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews is working every day in Israel and around the world, providing security, emergency assistance, food, and critical care for vulnerable Jewish communities. For more than 40 years, the fellowship has stood alongside the Jewish people, delivering practical support when it is needed the most. Hatred, it continues to spread, but compassion and action can make a world of difference. So I want you to join the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews and me in doing one simple thing: praying for the safety of the Jewish people, for peace in Israel, and for an end to anti-Semitism. Together, we can remind God's people that they are not alone. If you want to know what to pray for, you can stand with Israel in prayer today by visiting prayifcj.org. That is prayifcj.org.
Ultimately, you're in the AG's office. You go get a job in corporate America at Monsanto, which paid you a good chunk of money, but was not rewarding, and you were not happy with corporate America. And then Jack Danforth has gone to the Senate, and you go work for him in the Senate. And you're a Capitol Hill staffer, and you go to a conference with Thomas Sowell.
Yeah, he invited me personally to that in San Francisco.
And at the time, you're a Republican staffer, but you're on the journey. One of the things I try to do in the book is chronicle the intellectual journey and awakening from an angry left-wing radical to a principled conservative. That's a pretty big shift. And reading was an important part of it. Questioning was an important part of it. But you've described how you're sitting at lunch table with Juan Williams, the reporter, having what you thought was a conversation, and it was one of your first interactions with the press, and it ended up having a big feature article in the Washington Post describing you as the black conservative, which was a pretty startling thing for you.
Well, I'd never call myself conservative. That was a way of character. They called us black conservatives in order to dispose of us. They called Tom Sowell that, Walter Williams, Jay Parker, who's another dear friend, has passed away. But I was shocked. Remember now, I'm 32 years old.
Yeah.
I'm a Hill staffer. I've never been in the press. Had just made my first trip to California.
You got the inkling that there was going to be something on you when they sent a photographer to take a picture.
I was sharing an office with 3 other staffers, and this photographer shows up from the Post. And December 16, 1980, there's my smiling face on the op-ed page, and then my whole life changed. The attacks, the negativity.
And there is a nastiness as a black conservative that I don't think anyone else experiences. You get some of it as an Hispanic who's a conservative, because I'm not supposed to be a conservative, but you're really not supposed to be a conservative. And there's part of the reason I wanted to write the book is the vitriol that has been directed at you is different. Look, Justice Scalia, you knew him extremely well. He was brilliant, extraordinarily principled. He never had the kind of hate directed to him that you did. And the left, they view you, a black man is not allowed to think that way. You're a traitor for it. And that, there's an ugliness to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's, you know, I grew up, I've been fortunate to have had misfortunes. And one of the things you learned during segregation is there was this idea that, boy, don't you know your place.
Yep.
And that's the same thing. I mean, these are the same, some of the worst people that you would meet, like the progressives. That's why I mentioned people like Woodrow Wilson, one of the early progressives, who was
a vicious racist.
Yeah, but see, underneath that, and Paul Johnson makes the point that you scratch the surface of things like of the Marxists and the socialists. That's what you find, because they have to categorize people. So I understand that. But I crossed that bridge in my early 30s that I accepted that this is the way they were going to treat me. This is what was going to happen. This is what would happen. And who knew where it would lead? But God would take care of that part.
Yeah.
But the fact that they have all this vitriol, to me, is a white flag that they have no argument.
Yep.
When you start calling,
if they think you're wrong, persuade you.
Look, I'm open to reason, but I will not be told what to do.
Right.
No one cajoles me. No one makes me do anything. Slavery is over. But there's this sense that don't you know what you're supposed to think? And that is, with me, that is the wrong argument.
Well, and related to that, one of the things that you have really powerfully written and spoken about is with affirmative action and racial quotas, it brings with it a stigma. You rather famously put a sticker of 15 cents on your Yale law degree from a cigar box. Because, and you talked about coming out of Yale, but not being able to get a job. And look, I went to school at a different time than you did, but I'll tell you, as an Hispanic, I still remember this one supercilious liberal in law school explaining that everyone who wasn't a white man was on the law review because of affirmative action. That was the only reason anyone could possibly do well, is because they were giving us this gift, and it was infuriating.
You know, there are many slights along the way.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make you wrong. These are little bumps in the road. And what I compare it to, again, I compare it to what my grandparents went through. Like, just take my grandfather.
Yeah.
If I'm going to complain, right, I have to look at him, at a man who didn't complain. He never knew his father. His mother dies when he's 6 or 7, maybe 8. And then he goes to live with his grandmother, who's a freed slave who lives on a part of the plantation that they're from. Okay?
Just pause for a second and think about the marvel of America. That your grandfather who raised you was raised by his grandmother who was a freed slave. And now you are in the second longest serving Supreme Court justice in American history, and in a couple of years will be the longest serving. That is, it's one of the things. Look, those who point to the flaws in our nation's history, they're not wrong. Our racial history in particular, it has been a history of injustice, and slavery was grotesque. But I agree with Dr. King that the arc of history is long and it bends towards justice. Yeah. And that journey was possible because of the principles America was built on, even if it took us decades and even centuries to begin living up to it.
Well, my grandfather would talk about don't throw out the Ten Commandments because people don't obey them. There's nothing wrong with the Ten Commandments. It's just we have weaknesses, or for whatever reasons, we don't comply.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes when you're angry and you see suffering and difficulties, you are willing to throw everything out, the baby with the bathwater. And as you get older, you can be more discerning. And one of the things I think that's unfortunate is that the people who should know better haven't stood up and defended those principles and asserted them and then tried to live up to them and not be hypocritical and not to sacrifice the principles for a share of the power, for a share of the loot that they're getting from the country or whatever. And so one of the things that I tried to do when I was in teasing out the speech at the University of Texas is to make this point. Two things that I wanted to talk about was the fact that here you had uneducated people who believed that God made them equal. And you had Irish nuns, immigrants, that believed strongly that God, in God's eyes, we're all equal. Yeah. And this was not to be debated. It was not, no matter what the laws around us said, this was not debatable. So now that means if they're Irish immigrants and uneducated people who no formal education believe this, my point was simply that it must be self-evident. Otherwise, how else would they know? The other part of it that I was interested in is there are a lot of nice words in the Declaration, for example. But what do they pledge? Their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor.
Yep.
And this is after what the king says, I'm going to hang all of you.
And that was not theoretical.
No, I know it. He was not happy.
Yeah.
But at any rate, my point is if you end it by saying, I'm willing to die for this. Now, that gives value to what you just said. In your wedding vows, you say, I do, and you mean it.
Right.
You said you've been married, 29 years?
25.
25 years. So that gives content to your wedding vow.
Yeah.
When I said I do to my wife, that gives content. Otherwise, it's just nice words. And I think one of the things, and this goes back to my point about leaving the seminary, do you really mean it?
Right.
Do you really believe as a church what you said you believe? And it was the gap between that, what you said, the church said, and what the leadership seemed to a 19-year-old to believe. And I think in this country now, think about it. When last have you had a leader that said something that is the equivalent of I pledge my life, my property, my fortune, and my sacred honor?
So you referenced the speech you gave at University of Texas. I want to commend all the listeners here. Go and listen to that speech. It really was an extraordinary speech. I'm proud of UT. I spent a couple of years on the faculty as an adjunct law professor there. And look, most law schools are so left-wing. I'm proud of UT for inviting you there. The president, Jim Davis, is a good friend, had you there. But it really is an important speech and conversation. And if folks haven't listened to it, they should. What I want to do in the interest of time, that there are additional chapters in your life from being a Hill staffer to an assistant secretary of the Department of Education to the chairman of the EOC and the Reagan administration to a Court of Appeals judge on the D.C. Circuit to going through one of, if not the most brutal confirmation hearing of any justice. You and Brett Kavanaugh can arm wrestle for who had the rougher time, but in many ways and I talk about this in the book, how what Justice Kavanaugh went through was a replay of the playbook that you were subjected to. I want to skip over all of those periods, although I recount them in detail in the book. And I want to go to after you are confirmed and you're sworn in and you're in your early 40s and suddenly you're a Supreme Court justice. And your autobiography ends with your being a justice. So it tells your life story, but then does not cover your jurisprudence. I want to start with just a human thing. What's it like the first day you're a justice? You walk in, like just what's day one of being a Supreme Court justice?
Well, you feel a little small and like, what the heck am I doing here? Which was still a question. But this is, as I said, and just Lord grant me the wisdom to know what's right and the courage to do it. That has been a constant plea of mine. And it is what brought me back to the church, stopping at first St. Nicholas, then sometimes St. Mary's, and sometimes St. Joe, to just ask for the wisdom and to know what is right and the courage to do it. But it is just you pledge to, I gave President Bush my promise. I took an oath. He said, "Can you call him as you see him?" He asked me that in Kennebunkport, July 1, 1991. And I said, I can. And that's what I've lived up to. My grandfather, when I asked him, when I was being attacked in the early 80s, 1982, I said, "What should I do?" He said, "Boy, you got to stand up for what you believe in." It's pretty simple. And I must say, I'm on the other side of that spectrum now, but I was treated royally, fabulously by my new colleagues. Your old boss, Chief Justice Rehnquist, Justice Scalia, Stevens, O'Connor, a great woman who doesn't get the credit she deserves, Justice Kennedy. And now I'm on the other side of it where I have newer colleagues, wonderful and brilliant young people like Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, you mentioned. We have Amy Barrett.
Right.
And then Sam Alito and I were at Yale together. Just a wonderful, wonderful.
Now, you were classmates at Yale.
He was a year behind.
He was a year behind you, but you didn't know each other.
He's a funny guy. He's brilliant. He was always nerdy, Princeton guy like you, right?
Yeah.
And so I said, "Sam, how come we were there 2 years together? Why weren't we friends?" "Clarence, you were scary." I did. It was really, I'm so glad they didn't have these phones where you could take a lot of pictures. I wore bib overalls throughout law school and combat boots, and just, it was awful. But you have just, the chief has been a good friend. But my point is simply this, that, I was embraced there. It was a different generation. It's the World War II, Byron White. They were just wonderful people. They were very kind to me. The court's changed a bit now since the Dobbs leak. Back then, there was a trust.
Yes.
There was an honor, even as you disagreed. There were lines you did not cross, and I like that. These people were the age of my mother, and older.
Yeah.
And so it was a different era, and now it's a different generation now. But the point is that you have equally good people who are there. I mean, I knew some of them as law clerks, but they've become very dear friends. And I hope to be a model to them as the older members of the court who were there when I arrived were to me.
So of all the justices who have served on the court, I think you are the most willing to reconsider precedent and to think of an issue anew, which is in some ways to think about it as it was, in fact, in many ways, to think of it as it was originally understood. And that, your opinion writing is, you write straightforward opinions in ordinary English. You don't tend to use fancy highfalutin words, but your opinions are written so that the regular person can read them and understand what you're saying. And I think there's a workmanship quality to your opinions. I analogize it to a farmer or someone building a home that you draw that same analogy. Why do you think it is that you are the most willing to reconsider precedent?
I start with something you and I think, have talked about over the years, and that is that I start with something has to make sense.
Quote from your grandfather: "If it don't make no damn sense, it don't make no damn sense."
Yeah, and I keep that in my office.
Yeah.
Because he would call some of these professors fast talking.
Yeah.
And you think about it, we have had throughout history court intellectuals who can make all sorts of justifications for things and theories and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I've been blessed because I can sort through the theories, and I read lots and lots and lots of books.
Yep.
And I've been at it a long time. And I have young people who have that energy, and you say, we're going to go find the answer. Now, it may not be what we want, but we're going to go look for it. And what we find in many instances is it's been a theory. So you can have, you can deductive reasoning. You have a theory and you work down. Or you can have inductive, which any rancher or farmer uses, which is you do something and it's experience and you keep generalizing up to something more general. And that's the world I grew up. The latter is the world I grew up in. If I cannot explain it to that guy on the ranch, and if he has said, boy, that don't make no sense, he should be when I go out to ordinary people, they should be able to understand their constitution.
And by the way, ordinary people, one thing people may not know, you do that a lot. You and Jenny go out in your RV, like in the summertime, you head across the country and are in Walmart parking lots just hanging out with regular people.
Well, Buc-ee's now, but...
All right, now as a Texan, that makes me happy. Buc-ee's that...
Buc-ee's is a destination. But, I grew up with as my granddad said, po folks.
Yeah.
And that's the world I like. I like people who work with their hands. I like people who are regular people. That's my preferred world. And, my wife laughs at me because our motor coach is 35 years old. So I like the old buses. Yeah. And so you hang out with the guys who do work on old buses. And I got to spend time with one of them in the December, and we're like, we take all the wheels off, and you're up. I said, that was happy as I could be, because you're under there. You got all the shocks, all the airbags, the lines. He's showing you all these things, the valves, and it was just I wish I could spend 2 weeks there instead of 2 days, but. The point is, it's their constitution.
Yep.
It's that truck driver's constitution. It's that school teacher's constitution. It's not the preserve of court intellectuals and law professors. And we've turned it into that. We've over-intellectualized it. This is a point that Murray Rothbard makes in his book, Conceived in Liberty, okay? That we've taken something that was passionately achieved and that was believed in passionately, and we turned it into this thing that you need an oracle to explain.
Yeah, the Federalist Papers were newspaper editorials,
and they were only in New York, by the way.
Yeah.
And those were basically Hamilton and those guys. That's why people don't know. There's a big difference between Hamilton and some of the more radical guys, like a Sam Adams, which is more than a beer, by the way. But
I will admit there was an amusing exchange of one commentator on the left who was on TV saying, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, can you imagine those people overthrowing the government? And I couldn't help but respond, yes, I can.
Absolutely.
It kind of happened. Did. Yeah. One of the things you have been really eloquent on, and I think profoundly influential on, is the Constitution is the foundational document that created our government. But you have focused a great deal on the Declaration of Independence, and why is the Declaration so important, and what is the relevance that people should know about it?
Well, the Constitution sets up the government, the form of the government. But what precedes that? Yeah. What does it mean? What defines you, your rights? How do they view your rights? Where do they come from? And where does the government come from? And it sets the order right. Just take it simple. It says your rights come from God, basically, from nature's God. And then from that, you give up some of those God-given natural rights in order to be governed.
Yeah.
And what does that lead to? That leads to the Constitution. I was pointing out to my clerks the other day, because you get these Second Amendment cases. And I said, why do we keep saying there's a Second Amendment right? The Second Amendment says the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. It assumes a right. It doesn't grant a right.
Yep.
And so you can go First Amendment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Where does that come from? And that's what I was interested in. That what establishes this whole notion of liberty? What establishes this order of rights? And so it matters if you think the government is the primary grantor of rights, and you receive rights and benefits from the government, versus you have the rights and the government receives its authority from you. And I think that order, being able to establish that in each case, is important. And that's, if you go back, and that explains Justice Scalia's writings on the structure of the Constitution being the safeguard of these rights that you have that are antecedent and that are transcendent. So I focus on that to always get the order right. When you farm, every farmer knows, like when you plant or when you plow, I don't know if you've ever plowed, but
I'm a city boy, so I've watched it on TV.
So my granddaddy said, boy, and that he would always say, and he put a little cuss word in there from time. He said, and those rows better be straight. So you have to take your first row, and it has to be absolutely straight. Then you put your tire in a groove. Yeah. Where the plows, especially if you're using a dish plow, and they go different ways, you go and you follow that. So now every subsequent row is straight. Well, going back to your point about precedent, what if that first row is crooked? What do you keep going, pretending that it's straight, or do you go back and make it straight?
Right.
That's why you say, well, I'm not accepting precedent. If something doesn't make any sense, I can't. What am I going to do? Am I a fool for following that or not questioning it? And I taught a course on stare decisis, just for this point. It makes sense when you have this unwritten laws, and when you have traditions, and when barons are like ruling on cases in these rural areas in England. But when you have positive law, when it's written down and you can see the deviation, who's the fool? You follow something that's absurd. Why would you follow something that's absurd?
Well, look, a great example of that, and a case I talk about quite a bit in the book, is the Kelo case, where Kelo involved a city that was condemning a woman's home.
That they had for 100 years.
Yes.
It's a tiny house, regular person's house, not a mansion, and for a public purpose, not a public use. And that started in Southwest D.C., by the way. Yeah. The precedent for that. And the court was willing to say that the public purpose was the equivalent of public use. Well, a public purpose could be to increase your tax base.
Well, and actually, as I was driving over here to do this, I wanted to look. I pulled up the language of the Fifth Amendment, and the relevant prohibition at the end of it is, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Yeah. So that's the actual language. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Kelo, unfortunately, it was 5-4. The majority said that the city of New London, Connecticut could take her home, not for a highway or a road or a city building, but for a parking lot for a planned Pfizer building, and you dissented. You dissented, and it focused on the words public use versus purpose, and explain that distinction to us.
Well, purpose is a very broad term, and
the court in its precedent had basically turned use into purpose.
but there's another thing, a principle or that we have followed for years, which is the government doesn't take private property from person A and give it to private person B.
Right.
That's not a public use. So, but going back to your point that a public use would be a park, it'd be a hospital, it'd be a highway, etc. Something that the public uses. A public purpose doesn't necessarily is much broader. So just imagine you have a somewhat blighted area.
Yep.
But suddenly it's attractive to people with lots of money. And a city decides, well, we'd like to increase our tax base. Well, there are all these young people with lots of money who want to build these McMansions.
Yep.
Or these high-end $2 or $3 million structures. Well, the public purpose would be to increase that tax base, but that's not a public use.
Yep.
And now you've given people who have authority to take your property a much broader way and much more power to take an individual's property. Now, why is the issue? I took quite a bit of property at Yale for this reason. If you go back to Georgia, if you go back to the South, you go to places like South Carolina, there was all this land that blacks owned in the way that my family received land over the years. It was called heirs property.
Yep.
Everybody owns it. Nobody's really in charge. Well, a lot of that land was there was aggressive effort. There were aggressive efforts to use that land for developments. It could be for resorts in Hilton Head. It could be for strategic purposes in Harris Neck, Georgia. It could be for conservation in places where blacks were subsistence farmers, like in McIntosh, Georgia. So my only point is simply this, that the word, if you want to protect the property, you have to stick to the words in the Constitution, or it sort of spreads out to broader powers that were not intended, and public purpose allows it. Plus, that word appears no place in the Constitution.
Well, I will say, even though you were in dissent, you did not command the majority in the court. I think over time, the view you articulated has prevailed, and it's persuaded. Texas and many other states have enacted laws to prevent the taking of public property for public purposes, and it was inspired by your very, Justice O'Connor used an effective analogy in dissent in that case where she said under this reasoning, the government could condemn every Motel 6 and to build a Ritz-Carlton.
Yeah, and she's right.
Yeah.
And she and I, and remember, she comes from a rancher.
Yeah.
I think just think about it, hand in hand with liberty. You had, they were traveling companions, liberty and property. Okay, wherever you see it, if you look at the due process clause, what does it protect?
Life, liberty, and property.
Okay, wherever you see it. And that was my grandfather. What did he say? We're poor. He said, a little bit of land, you get to raise crops, you get to build a little place to live, you get to raise some animals, okay? The property was a part of your way to take care of yourself. So liberty and property, it was the fruit of your labor. So you worked in the cornfield, you planted it, you took care of it, you harvested it. It's yours. And the land is yours. You earned it. And I think you see throughout the founding, all those things those were always paired, liberty and property. And we treat it as though it's a benefit from the government rather than a right that transcends the government and is to be protected from the government.
One thing you did there just a minute ago that is really powerful and that is a consistent theme of your jurisprudence is you understand the rights protected in the Constitution with an understanding of the context of history. So when you're talking about condemning land or property for public purpose rather than use, you quickly brought it to when government power is used, historically it has been used over and over by the rich and powerful against the more vulnerable in society, often against African Americans or Hispanics or people who don't necessarily have the ability to defend themselves against government power. That's something also that you've powerfully done in the Second Amendment context. And one of the things that you've said, you and I, when we were sitting down doing interviews, you talked about the importance of Reconstruction, that if you're going to understand American history and the Constitution, you got to understand Reconstruction. Tell us about that.
Well, it's everything. I mean, it's, I think Reconstruction. Why'd you have Reconstruction? I mean, because you had the Civil War, you had slaves that were freed, you had the South that was not going to do what it should do, and so you basically had the military in the South. And after Reconstruction, of course, you got the Redeemers, you got the Redeemers. You have the former Confederates who've been disempowered, disenfranchised, and they start forming these vigilante groups. And who are they going after? They're going after the Republicans in the South. They're going after particularly the freedmen.
Right.
And what's the argument? If you just take a look at it, you'd see they would maraud, they would intimidate, they would lynch, and there was a big difference. But the 14th Amendment is passed.
Yep.
And the whole point is to now make these slave citizens. But there's something further going on. If you look at the debates in the 14th Amendment, the argument is these people have a right to defend themselves.
Yep.
Now, the radical Republicans felt that with these rights, privileges or immunities,
right,
also brings the right to bear arms. Okay? They have a right to defend themselves from these marauders. And anyone who lives in a rural area, who was in the South, it could be in Texas, in rural Texas, everybody is armed for a variety of reasons, to defend themselves, to hunt, etc.
Yep.
And if you live in rural Georgia, I didn't know anybody who didn't have at least one weapon.
Yeah.
And you could have like a mad dog. You could have a 6-foot rattlesnake. You could have a moccasin. You could have all sorts of things. And you could have an opportunity to kill an animal for food. But my point is that the radical Republicans understood that without that right to defend themselves.
And fundamentally, it's a right to life, a right to protect your life, your kid's life, your family. I mean,
that was the point. That was the Freedmen Bureau. If you look at the reports, they're getting killed down here with the Knights of Camellia, the Ku Klux Klan, etc. And so you get the 14th Amendment,
right,
and defining them, of course, answering Tawney and responding to his notion that blacks cannot be citizens, but it also brings in the Privileges or Immunities Clause.
And Tawney was the author of Dred Scott, which, if there's a decision that is more disgraceful than Plessy versus Ferguson, it was Dred Scott.
Well, it is for a lot of different reasons. I've spent a lot of time on Dred Scott and the history around Dred Scott. But the whole point is that here's a man who's trying to figure out a way to say that no way blacks could ever be citizens of this country, just by their very nature. And, of course, we revisit that old notion in the birthright case last term, but in a different way and for different reasons. But the 14th Amendment in this country is critical because it's basically the second founding.
Yep.
And so you have to understand that. So what I think I owe my fellow citizens is not just to read the words of the Constitution, but to try to understand not just the 14th Amendment, But the revolution, leading up to the revolution, the history of England, the things that influence it, the Civil War, the post-Civil War, the Reconstruction era, and you may have to read people you don't necessarily agree with.
Sure.
For example, I read and reread Eric Foner on Reconstruction. Now, he's a revisionist historian, but he's fine. He does a great job of explaining Reconstruction and a lot of these problems, and I admire the work that he's done. And at the same time, you may not agree with the revolutionary period with Murray Rothbard because he's a libertarian, but he's written a couple of thousand pages on this, on conceived in liberty, and it's worth reading because it gives you that sort of granular understanding of the revolutionary period.
But you told me a story about Justice Breyer when he was robbed. And if you just share that story.
Poor Steve Breyer. He's such a good man. So Steve, this is a joke, and I hope I don't offend Steve. He is such.
He's a very decent man.
We spent a lot of years sitting next to each other. What a fun time. But at any rate, so Steve Breyer, he'd been robbed, and he didn't want it to be public. He didn't want the attention. In Nevis, where they have little property there, and he said, he's telling the story to a number of others as I walk in the room, that he turns to me because I wasn't there at the beginning. He said, "Clarence, I had a question for you. You're on your porch, you're playing bridge with another couple, you and your wife, and a guy walks up with a machete. What would you do?" And I said, "I don't play bridge." He said, okay. You're playing poker. And the guy walks up with a machete, and he says, he demands money. What would you do? He said, "I don't play poker. I don't play cards, Steve." He said, "What would you be doing on your porch?" I said, "Cleaning my guns." And I said, "Do you want some ketchup with that?" But at any rate, he is such, I hope that doesn't offend him. He is the nicest man, and that goes back. Let me just say a word. You ask about, the court and the work, et cetera. It's a human institution. And I've been blessed because I get along with the members of the court. We have a different set of colleagues now, but they're wonderful. You've got Neil and Louise Gorsuch, they're delightful, just wonderful couple. And, it takes a few years to get your legs, and he's done that. Brett Kavanaugh was just the nicest person, he and his wife, Ashley. She's a Texan. Yeah. You've got the Alitos, Martha Ann and Sam. Again, and the chief and Jane. I mean, it's a wonderful group of people, and it was when I came on the court. It's different now because I'm the oldest member as opposed to the youngest, or as the New York Times said, the youngest and the cruelest. It's just I've just changed perspective, but still, it's a human institution with decent people on board.
So I saw Brett and Ashley at Lindsey Graham's funeral, and they've been friends. I've known them for 30 years. Yeah. Ashley was on the 2000 George W. Bush campaign with Heidi and me. So we were all young staffers on that campaign. So I saw the two of them at Lindsey's funeral. I actually told Brett at the funeral a story during his confirmation hearing when Lindsey Graham went off. And I think it's Lindsey was a dear friend of mine, and it was his finest moment, I believe, as a senator, where he unloaded on the unfairness of what was happening. And my mother had not previously been a fan of Lindsey Graham's. Yeah. And in the hearing, she texts me, and she says, "Okay, I now love Lindsey Graham." And she goes online and gives him $40. Yeah. And so I walk over to Lindsey, I pull out my phone, and I show him the text from my mom, and Lindsey is cracking up laughing.
Well, it is really interesting, and that goes to our country. People like people who stand up for what's right.
Amen.
And as I said to you from the beginning, I do not understand a lot about this town. I don't know who has the time for all this animus toward other people. I don't spend any of my day on that sort of thing. But the lying that takes place, the attacks on financial disclosure, which was it was laughable in one way, but just painful to just the lies.
Yeah.
But you and the Mike Lee and the others who stood up are dearly appreciated, because we could not believe the inundation of just misstatements and falsehoods. And we don't have the capacity at the court to defend ourselves.
Yep.
We don't have a bully pulpit or anything like that. Most of us just simply are doing our jobs. And we can disagree. In the old days, I think I first became aware of the court when they're riding along US 17 between Savannah and the farm. There were these impeach Earl Warren signs after Brown v. Board of Education. And so I understand that people have different ways of reacting to the work that we do, but this current environment that we're in is quite different from signs saying impeach Earl Warren.
Well, Justice, let me say thank you. Thank you. You've been incredibly generous with your time. Thank you for joining us on this podcast. Thank you for spending the time in the interviews to write this book. And look, I've said this before, but you are a true American hero. And I want to say to the folks listening, if you're a young person, there are a lot of young people that listen to this podcast. If you are a young person and you're looking for someone to admire, someone to emulate, someone to walk along a path and be inspired by, you would be very hard-pressed to find a better role model than Clarence Thomas. And that's why I wrote this book, because I think you are an incredibly historically significant human being and leader with courage and principle, and I am grateful. You can order the book, goingfurther.com, pre-order the book, buy it for your family. I think you'll like it. I think you'll learn. I hope in this podcast you've seen why I admire Justice Thomas so much, and why I think you should as well. And thank you very much, and we'll see you on the next podcast. Thank you, Justice.
Thank you.